Sarah Chen had planned the road trip for months, mapping out a solo drive through the mountains as a deliberate act of reclaiming something she'd lost somewhere in the exhausting 3 years since her divorce. A sense that she could still make decisions purely for herself, without consulting anyone, without managing anyone else's expectations of what her life should look like. She'd packed the car with careful, methodical precision, downloaded offline maps as backup in case cell service failed the way it sometimes did in remote mountain country, and set out on a route that would take her through some of the most isolated terrain in the region over the course of a week, sleeping in small roadside motels, stopping wherever the scenery moved her to stop. She hadn't planned for the storm. The forecast, when she'd checked it that morning at a gas station 2 hours back, had called for scattered snow showers, nothing severe enough to warrant changing her planned route over the mountain pass that would save her nearly 3 hours compared to the longer valley road. By the time she understood how badly that forecast had underestimated what was actually building over the peaks ahead of her, she was already committed to the pass, snow falling harder with every mile she climbed, visibility dropping in stages until she was driving essentially blind, following the vague suggestion of a road beneath accumulating white rather than any clearly visible pavement. Her GPS, which had been struggling with intermittent signal for the better part of an hour, finally died completely somewhere past the pass's midpoint, the screen flickering once and then going dark in a way that felt, in the moment, considerably more ominous than a simple technical failure should have. Her phone had no signal at all, hadn't had reliable signal in nearly 40 minutes, and the offline maps she'd downloaded as backup, she discovered with a sinking, disbelieving horror, had somehow failed to actually save properly before she'd left cell range that morning. She was alone, on an unfamiliar mountain pass, in a whiteout, severe enough that she could barely make out the edges of her own hood, with no navigation, no phone signal, and a road that had stopped feeling like a road several miles back, transformed instead into an undifferentiated field of white that she was navigating on instinct and increasingly desperate hope alone. The crash, when it happened, felt almost anticlimactic after the mounting dread of the drive leading up to it. A soft shoulder she never saw coming, snow disguising the drop-off until her front wheel caught nothing but air, and the car slid, with a slow, sickening lurch, off the edge of what she'd been following as the road, and down a shallow embankment into a stand of pine trees that stopped her descent with a jarring, metal-crunching impact that left her shaken, but she registered with disbelieving relief, apparently unhurt beyond the bruising press of her seatbelt. The car wouldn't start. The engine, when she turned the key, produced nothing but a single defeated click, and Sarah sat in the driver's seat of a disabled vehicle, off the road, in a blizzard, with no phone signal and no clear sense of how far she'd need to walk in any direction to find help. Understanding with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its simplicity, that she might genuinely be facing a life-threatening situation with no reliable way to summon rescue. She stayed with the car as long as she reasonably could, running the heater in careful bursts to conserve what fuel remained, watching the light fail outside as afternoon slid toward a dusk she couldn't clearly see through the storm's relentless white. It was full dark, the temperature inside the car dropping towards something she understood, with the particular clarity of genuine fear, could eventually become dangerous, when she saw the light. It moved through the storm steadily, a lantern's glow rather than a flashlight's harder beam, approaching with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew this terrain well enough not to be disoriented by conditions that had nearly killed her. Sarah rolled down her window, enough to call out, her voice thin and strange in the howling wind, and watched the light change direction, moving toward her with new purpose. The man who reached her car crouched down to her window level, his face weathered and calm, in a way that suggested considerable practiced experience with exactly this kind of rescue, and assessed her condition with quick, efficient questions before he ever offered his own introduction. "Are you hurt? Can you walk?" "I think I'm okay," Sarah managed, her voice unsteady with cold and shock in equal measure. "The car won't start. I don't know where I am. My phone died an hour ago." "You're about 2 miles from my place," the man said. Close a shelter for probably 15 miles in any direction. We need to move now, before this gets worse. Can you walk that far? She could, barely, wrapped in every blanket she could pull from her trunk, and leaning heavily on his steady arm, through a walk that stretched into what felt like hours, though he assured her, checking his watch periodically with the careful attention of someone monitoring exactly how much time they had before conditions worsened further, that it was closer to 40 minutes. He introduced himself only once they'd reached the cabin, a solid, well-built structure tucked into a stand of trees that offered considerably more protection from the wind than the exposed stretch where she'd crashed. His name delivered simply, without elaboration, as he got a fire going with the efficient competence of long practice. "Daniel," he said, "you're safe here. Storm's supposed to blow through by tomorrow afternoon, but until then, you're stuck with my company, I'm afraid." Sarah, wrapped in blankets by a growing fire, finally beginning to feel warmth return to fingers that had gone properly numb during the walk, found herself studying this stranger, who'd appeared out of a blizzard to save her life, with a curiosity that went beyond simple gratitude. Something in the careful, guarded way he moved through his own home, something in the particular loneliness that seemed to live behind his steady, competent kindness, that made her wonder, even in that first exhausted hour, exactly what had brought a man to build an entire solitary life, this far from anyone else. The storm held the mountain in its grip for 3 full days, far longer than the forecast Daniel had originally cited, and Sarah found herself, over that stretch of enforced proximity, slowly assembling a portrait of a man who seemed, in ways she couldn't quite articulate at first, to be deliberately incomplete about his own history. He was competent in ways that suggested considerable formal training, rather than simply years of self-taught wilderness survival. She noticed it first in the careful, methodical way he'd assessed her for injury and shock that first night. Questions and observations that felt less like an experienced outdoorsman's practical knowledge and more like something closer to actual medical training. She noticed it again in the small library of books lining one wall of his cabin, technical volumes on subjects that seemed oddly specific for a man living entirely off-grid. Engineering texts, advanced mathematics, a handful of titles in what she eventually recognized as specialized computer science, badly out of date by at least a decade based on their publication years. "You weren't always up here," she said, on the second evening, watching him repair a section of fence that the storm had damaged, working with the same careful, practiced competence he brought to everything. It wasn't quite a question. Daniel's hands stilled briefly on his work, before resuming, a small telling pause that told her she'd touched something he'd rather have left undisturbed. "No," he admitted, "not always." "Can I ask what happened?" "You can ask," he said, not unkindly, "but I'd rather not answer yet. Not because I don't trust you, because some things are easier to explain once you already know someone a little better than 3 days in a blizzard together." Sarah respected the boundary, though her curiosity only deepened over the following day, watching small details accumulate that painted an increasingly puzzling picture. A framed photograph, tucked into a drawer rather than displayed, that she glimpsed only accidentally while searching for a spare blanket, showing a considerably younger Daniel in what looked like professional attire, standing beside people who might have been colleagues or family, in a setting that looked nothing like the isolated mountain life he currently lived. A stack of old newspapers, yellowed with age, that she noticed tucked beneath a stack of firewood near the stove, seemingly kept rather than simply used as kindling, though she couldn't make out enough of the visible text to understand why he'd preserved them. It was on the 3rd day, the storm finally beginning to ease enough, that Daniel mentioned, almost regretfully, that he'd likely be able to help her arrange a ride back down the mountain within another day or two, that Sarah finally worked up the nerve to ask the question that had been building since that first night's careful, guarded conversation. "Daniel," she said, watching him prepare their dinner with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything, "what's your last name?" He went very still, the same telling pause she'd noticed once before, considerably more pronounced this time. "Why do you ask?" "Because I want to know who saved my life," Sarah said honestly, And because I keep noticing things that don't add up. The books, the photograph I saw by accident, the way you talk about medicine and mathematics and computer science, like someone who actually studied those things formally, not like someone who just picked up practical skills living alone in the woods. Daniel set down what he was working on and looked at her for a long moment, something weighing visibly behind his careful, guarded expression. A decision, she understood, watching him, that he'd been avoiding making since the moment she'd first arrived, now finally forced into the open by her direct question. "Wren," he said finally. "Daniel Wren. Does that name mean anything to you?" Sarah searched her memory, the name tugging at something distantly familiar, without quite resolving into clear recognition. "Should it?" "Probably not," Daniel said, something almost like relief entering his voice, though it didn't fully erase the tension still visible in his posture. "Most people have forgotten, or never knew in the first place, depending on how closely they followed the news back then." "What news?" Sarah asked, though some instinct, some accumulated weight of all the small details she'd been noticing over 3 days, told her she already sensed the shape of the answer, even before he spoke it. "I disappeared," Daniel said simply. 10 years ago, there was a search, a missing persons case that ran for months before it eventually went cold. I imagine, if you looked hard enough, you'd still find my face on some database somewhere, still officially listed as missing, presumed dead by most people who ever knew me. Sarah sat with this revelation for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, working through the particular vertigo of understanding that the man who'd saved her life, who'd fed her and sheltered her and kept her safe through 3 days of a storm, severe enough to have genuinely threatened her survival, existed, in every official record she could imagine, as a person who no longer existed at all. "Why?" she asked finally, the question containing multitudes she wasn't entirely sure how to fully articulate. "Why did you disappear? What happened?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, with an expression that suggested he was deciding, even now, exactly how much of the full story he was prepared to share with a woman he'd known for 3 days, however intense and isolated those 3 days had been. "I was an engineer," he said finally. "Worked for a company developing autonomous systems for infrastructure monitoring, bridges, dams, that kind of critical structural work. I discovered about 10 years ago that the company was cutting corners on safety testing for a system being deployed on several major dam projects. Corners that I believed, based on my own technical analysis, created genuine risk of catastrophic failure under certain conditions the shortened testing protocol hadn't properly evaluated." "You tried to report it," Sarah said, already anticipating the general shape of the story even before he continued. "I tried everything," Daniel said, old bitterness surfacing in his voice, despite a decade's distance from whatever had actually happened. "Internal channels first, then regulatory bodies once internal reporting went nowhere, and I started to understand how deep the corner cutting actually ran. How many people at senior levels had a financial interest in the flawed testing protocol staying exactly as flawed as it was. What I got, instead of any real investigation, was increasingly serious pressure to stay quiet, legal threats, professional blacklisting that started before I'd even fully realized what was happening to my career. And eventually, something considerably more frightening than either of those." "Someone threatened you," Sarah said quietly. "Someone made it very clear," Daniel said carefully, "that continuing to push the issue would have consequences considerably more serious than a ruined career. I never had definitive proof of exactly who or exactly what they were prepared to do, and that uncertainty was, in some ways, more frightening than a clear threat would have been. I made the decision, over the course of about 2 weeks of escalating fear, to simply disappear, rather than continue fighting a battle I'd become genuinely convinced I couldn't win safely." "And the dam systems?" Sarah asked. "The safety issue you'd found? What happened to that?" Daniel's expression carried a complicated weight of guilt and vindication in equal measure. "About 18 months after I disappeared, one of the systems failed exactly the way I'd warned it would, under exactly the conditions I'd flagged," as inadequately tested. Not catastrophically, thankfully. The failure was caught before it caused genuine structural damage. But it was serious enough that it triggered the kind of investigation I'd been trying to force from the very beginning. The company faced significant regulatory penalties. Several senior executives lost their positions. The testing protocols got overhauled properly, the way they should have been from the start. "So you were right," Sarah said. "You were vindicated. Why didn't you come back once that happened?" "Because by then," Daniel said, "I'd built an entire life up here, one where I no longer had to look over my shoulder, wondering whether the people who'd threatened me were still watching, still capable of following through on what they'd implied. I'd also, if I'm honest, become someone I wasn't entirely sure how to reintegrate into the life I'd left behind. 10 years alone, largely, changes a person in ways that don't simply reverse themselves the moment external circumstances change. I've thought about it over the years. I've never quite found the courage, or maybe the clarity, to actually follow through on going back. The rescue vehicle that eventually made it up the mountain road, once the storm had fully cleared, and Daniel had made contact with a search and rescue contact he apparently maintained through infrequent radio check-ins for exactly this kind of emergency, arrived on the 5th day of what should have been a simple 2-hour drive through the pass. And Sarah found herself, watching the vehicle approach, unexpectedly reluctant to leave. "You could come with me," she said, watching Daniel help load her salvaged luggage into the rescue vehicle with the same careful, competent efficiency he brought to everything. "Down the mountain, I mean. Not permanently, if you're not ready for that. But at least to see what it's like, after 10 years. You said yourself you'd been vindicated. The people who threatened you, that was a decade ago. Companies change. People move on. Maybe it's safer now than you think." Daniel considered this for a long moment, old caution visibly warring with something that looked, to Sarah's careful observation, like genuine longing for exactly the kind of reintegration she was suggesting. "I've thought about it more, these past 5 days, than I have in years," he admitted. "Talking to you, explaining it all out loud for the first time in a decade, it's made the whole story feel less like something I'm still hiding from, and more like something I actually survived." "So come down," Sarah said, "just to see. If it's too much, if it doesn't feel right, you can always come back up here. But you won't know unless you try." He didn't come down that first day, not fully ready yet to make so large a decision so abruptly, but he took her contact information, promised to think seriously about what she'd suggested, and walked with her partway down the road toward the waiting rescue vehicle, watching her go with an expression she recognized, even in that brief parting moment, as genuine reluctance to see her leave. It was nearly 3 weeks later, Sarah back in her ordinary life, but unable to fully stop thinking about the strange, intense 5 days that had reshaped her understanding of what courage and isolation and quiet survival could actually look like. When she received an unexpected call from a number she didn't recognize. "I did some research," Daniel's voice said, once she'd answered. Warmth and nervousness mixed together in a way she hadn't heard from him during their time together on the mountain, where his composure had felt considerably more settled. "Quietly, carefully, through some contacts I still trust. The company that threatened me collapsed almost entirely after the investigation you already know about. The specific executives who'd made the threats have scattered, moved on, lost whatever institutional power they once had to make good on what they'd implied. As far as I can determine, there's genuinely nothing left, 10 years later, standing between me and simply walking back into an ordinary life if I actually want to." "Do you want to?" Sarah asked carefully. "I think," Daniel said, "I want to try. And I think, if you're willing, I'd like to try it with someone who already knows the whole complicated story, rather than starting from scratch, trying to explain a decade of disappearance to people who'd have every reason to find the whole thing suspicious, rather than simply sad." The reintegration, when Daniel finally committed to it fully over the following months, proved considerably more complicated than either of them had fully anticipated during that hopeful phone call. Though Sarah found herself, watching him navigate each difficult stage of the process, increasingly certain that the man who'd emerged from 10 years of isolated survival was someone genuinely worth the effort of helping rebuild a life for. The legal process alone took months, establishing his continued identity after a decade officially listed as missing, working through the considerable bureaucratic complexity of a man who'd had no formal record of employment, residence, or financial activity for 10 straight years. Engaging lawyers Sarah helped him locate, who specialized in exactly this kind of unusual reintegration case. The investigative journalists who eventually caught wind of his story, once the legal proceedings became a matter of public record, brought their own complicated mixture of vindication and exposure. The original whistleblower case finally receiving the full public attention it had never gotten a decade earlier. Daniel's name finally cleared of any lingering suspicion about his original disappearance, once the full context of the corporate threats against him became part of the public record. "It's strange," Daniel told her, nearly a year into the process, sitting together in the small apartment he'd finally established in the town near the base of the mountain, close enough that he still visited his old cabin regularly, unwilling to fully abandon the solitary refuge that had kept him safe for so many years, even as he built something new alongside it. Being known again, having a name that means something to people, rather than just being the person nobody was looking for anymore. "Is it good strange or bad strange?" Sarah asked, watching him with the particular attentiveness that had grown over their year of careful, patient relationship building into something considerably deeper than the gratitude and curiosity that had first drawn her to him during those 5 snowbound days. "Mostly good," Daniel said, after genuine consideration. "Though I don't think I'll ever go back to exactly the kind of life I had before I disappeared. 10 years alone changes what you actually want, in the end. I don't need the career I once had, the recognition I once chased. I think I mostly just wanted to stop hiding. To be able to walk into a hardware store and give my real name without flinching, without watching the door the way I used to watch it up on that mountain, always half expecting some threat to finally catch up with me." He'd taken a position, eventually, consulting on infrastructure safety standards, or a regulatory body that had, in a turn of institutional irony neither of them had fully anticipated, actively sought him out once his original whistleblower case became public record. Understanding the genuine value of his decade-old technical analysis and his hard-won expertise in exactly the kind of safety oversight failures he'd originally tried to prevent. Sarah found herself watching the life they'd slowly, carefully built together over that first difficult year of reintegration, thinking often about the particular strangeness of how they'd actually met. A storm neither of them had fully anticipated. A crash that could easily have ended considerably worse than it had. A rescue that had, in ways neither of them could have predicted from that first desperate freezing night, led to a decade-old mystery finally finding its resolution. "Do you ever think about what would have happened?" she asked him one evening, nearly 2 years after that first blizzard, watching him work through paperwork for the safety consulting practice he'd built. "If I'd taken the valley road instead of the pass. If I'd never crashed, never needed rescuing, never stumbled into your cabin during exactly the storm that happened to be raging that particular week." Daniel considered the question with the same careful, thoughtful attention he brought to everything, setting his paperwork aside to look at her directly. "I think," he said slowly, "I might still be up on that mountain, alone, telling myself I wasn't ready to come back down, for however many more years it might have taken me to run out of reasons to keep hiding. I think you crashing into my life, quite literally, was exactly the kind of forced reckoning I needed, and never would have found the courage to create for myself." "So the blizzard was a good thing, in the end," Sarah said, something warm and settled in her voice. "The blizzard," Daniel agreed, reaching for her hand, "was the best thing that ever nearly killed either one of us."